In 1927, during excavation work at the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur in what is now southern Iraq, a small clay tablet is said to have been recovered from a sealed pottery jar buried beneath the ruins. According to secondary research accounts that have not been independently verified through mainstream archaeological publications. The jar had not been opened since antiquity. The tablet inside was reportedly no larger than a human palm, but the cuneiform pressed into its surface was described by those who later handled it as unusually fine and careful, more deliberate in its execution than typical administrative or grain record tablets from the same excavation layer. When the tablet reached the University of Pennsylvania Museum later that year, according to this account, an assistant cataloger examined it briefly, recorded a single line in the accession ledger. Content of religious or mythological nature, defer to senior staff. Assigned it the designation N2847 and placed it in a wooden drawer in the basement archive, where, according to this account, it remained unread for the next 44 years. What N2847 is claimed to describe, in a translation that did not circulate until the early 1970s, is the deliberate transportation of a small four-legged animal to Earth carried out by the figures known in Sumerian texts as the Anunnaki, for a purpose the tablet calls the watching, the guarding, and the keeping of the thin places. The animal the tablet describes, according to this proposed translation, is the domestic cat. This is a striking and very specific claim. It is drawn from a translation and an account that have not been verified through mainstream peer-reviewed Assyriology. Everything that follows is an exploration of this material as it exists in secondary research literature, not a presentation of established historical fact. Before we go further, if this kind of historical and archaeological exploration is what you're here for, subscribe now. Every week, this channel examines texts, tablets, and interpretive debates at the edges of mainstream scholarship. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Before going further into what the tablet claims, it is worth establishing what mainstream scholarship actually does document about the relationship between cats and the ancient Near East. Because the genuine history here is remarkable on its own terms, entirely separate from this specific tablet. What is not in dispute? Cats are well documented in the archaeological and artistic record of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. Genetic and archaeological research, published in peer-reviewed journals, traces the path toward cat domestication to the Fertile Crescent, understood by mainstream zooarchaeologists as a gradual, mutually beneficial process. Wild cats drawn to the grain stores of early agricultural settlements, and humans tolerating their presence for practical reasons. This is the consensus position within the relevant sciences. What is also not in dispute, and is genuinely extraordinary, ancient Egypt developed a level of reverence for cats with no parallel in any other ancient civilization. The goddess Bastet, depicted with a cat's head, was a protector of households and children. Cats were mummified in large numbers, buried in dedicated necropolises, and mourned with rituals documented to include shaving the eyebrows, a gesture reserved for significant loss. The legal status of cats under certain periods of Egyptian dynastic law has been extensively studied, and penalties for harming them were documented as severe. All of this is real, well-sourced, and available in mainstream Egyptological literature. What is not supported by any peer-reviewed Assyriological or Egyptological source is the specific claim now being explored, that a Sumerian tablet describes cats as having been deliberately transported to Earth by the Anunnaki to perform a defined protective function against non-physical entities. This claim exists entirely within alternative research literature and is absent from mainstream scholarship. With that context established, here is what tablet N2847 is claimed to contain. The researcher said to have produced the first translation of N2847 is identified in secondary accounts as Eleanor Ashworth, described as a junior philologist working on an academic exchange at the Penn Museum from Oxford in 1971. Her identity, academic affiliations, and the specific circumstances described in these accounts have not been confirmed through independent institutional records. According to this account, Ashworth was assigned to catalog a backlog of minor, unexamined tablets from the 1920s Nippur excavations, a collection of approximately 200 fragments, seal impressions, and minor tablets described by museum staff as the residue drawer. Most of what she found, per this account, was administrative. Grain inventories, property receipts, the routine bureaucratic record-keeping common to Mesopotamian archaeological sites. On the third week of her assignment, she is said to have unwrapped tablet N2847 from its oiled cotton casing and recognized within its first several lines that it was categorically different from the surrounding material. She reportedly wrote later in a private letter to a Cambridge colleague that the tablet did not belong with the residue, that it belonged somewhere for which the museum had no existing category. She reportedly spent close to 2 years producing a complete translation. When finished, she submitted it to 3 academic journals. All 3 declined. One reportedly cited unsuitability for serious philological publication. A second reported that peer reviewers could not reach agreement on whether the work was a legitimate translation or a fabrication. The third held the manuscript for 9 months before returning it without explanation. No peer-reviewed publication of Ashworth's translation has been identified in mainstream Sumerological literature. These rejection accounts have not been verified through journal records. The translation reportedly circulated privately afterward among a small number of colleagues and entered what the account describes as the fringe literature of Mesopotamian studies, where it has remained. None of this. Ashworth's identity, her translation, or the institutional account surrounding it, has been independently confirmed through mainstream academic channels. It is presented here as a claim in secondary literature, not as verified fact. According to the proposed translation, this is what the tablet says. The scribe identifies himself, per this reading, by a name rendered as Enmetar, described as a temple official connected to the household of the god Enlil at Nippur. He states, according to the proposed translation, that what follows was not composed by him, but passed down through his father's line, going back to what the text calls the days when the gods still walked among men, and the doors of the upper places had not yet been sealed. The phrase, the doors of the upper places, reportedly appears several times across the tablet. Ashworth is said to have spent close to a year determining what it referred to. Her proposed interpretation was that it described specific physical locations understood within the Sumerian belief system as points where the boundary between the everyday world and another layer of reality was unusually permeable. It is worth noting plainly, the concept of spiritually significant threshold points, or boundary locations, is genuinely and extensively documented across many authentic ancient religious systems, including aspects of real Sumerian and Babylonian cosmology and temple architecture. This specific tablet's framing draws on a real category of ancient religious thought. Whether it represents an authentic ancient text or a later construction drawing on that category is, given the tablet's unverified status, impossible to determine from currently available evidence. According to the proposed translation, the text describes a period of distress among early human settlements. Disturbed sleep, intrusive thoughts, and children waking in the night, all attributed within the narrative to entities said to approach through these threshold locations. The text describes these entities not as demons in any recognizable theological sense, but by a phrase Ashworth rendered as the unhoused, described as beings without physical bodies of their own, drawn to human dwellings by what the text calls the inner light, a figure named Ninkarak, a name that does appear in genuine, separately documented Sumerian texts in connection with healing and well-being, though in different contexts from what is claimed here, is said in this proposed translation to have proposed a solution. Bringing from another location, described only as the green star of the seventh house, a small creature already understood to perform a protective function in that setting. The phrase, the green star of the seventh house, has no established meaning in mainstream Sumerian astronomical or religious vocabulary. It does not correspond to a known term in the authentic Sumerian textual record, and its presence in the proposed translation is one of several features that mainstream Assyriologists, if they engaged with this material, would treat as a significant concern regarding the translation's authenticity. The creature is then described, per this reading, in considerable physical detail. 4 legs, a tail held in multiple positions, eyes that reflect light and darkness, silent and padded feet, a fur coat that produces static electricity when stroked against its grain. The text reportedly states that the creature spends the majority of its day in a sleep described not as ordinary rest, but as a watching that wears the appearance of resting. Readers will recognize this immediately as a description of a domestic cat, and that recognition itself is worth pausing on. The physical description, if accurately translated, does not require any unusual or advanced knowledge to write. Cats were a familiar and documented presence in Mesopotamian settlements by the period in question. A scribe describing a cat in these terms would be describing what they saw, which makes the physical description portion of the proposed translation the least evidentiary part of the account, regardless of one's view of the broader claims. The tablet, per this reading, uses a specific Sumerian term for the creature mushdub, which Ashworth reportedly translated with considerable hesitation as holder of the door. She is said to have noted herself that this term does not appear in any other surviving Sumerian tablet. The standard attested word for domestic cat in Sumerian is different. Her proposed explanation was that mushdub functioned as a specialized ceremonial or priestly term distinct from everyday vocabulary. A term appearing in only a single unverified source, without comparative attestation anywhere else in the Sumerian textual record, cannot be confirmed as an authentic ancient word through any standard methodology available to Assyriologists. This is one of the central features of the proposed translation that the mainstream field would regard as a serious authenticity concern. An entirely unique, unattested term that appears only in a disputed source, explained by a theory of specialized vocabulary that itself cannot be verified, is not something mainstream scholarship can accept on the basis of the claim alone. According to the proposed translation, the text describes the deployment of these creatures across early settlements, placed first in temples, then in priests' houses, then in royal households, and finally in ordinary dwellings. The order, per this reading, was deliberate. Temples were placed at the threshold locations and required the creature's presence most urgently. The text then describes 7 specific functions attributed to the cat's presence in a household. According to Ashworth's proposed reading, these are: first, a protective role during sleep, when the text says the inner light of a person becomes less anchored and therefore more accessible to the unhoused. The cat positioned near a sleeper is described as performing a stabilizing function. Second, a watching function at doorways, described within the text's framework as transition points and therefore points of vulnerability. Third, an inspection function when unfamiliar objects or people enter the dwelling. The cat's investigation described not as curiosity, but as a form of assessment. Fourth, a territorial marking function, the cat rubbing its face and body against surfaces, described in the text as creating a kind of protective seal over time. Fifth, a function attributed to the cat's sudden nocturnal movements, described in the text as active disruption of conditions under which unhoused entities were said to enter most easily. Sixth, the sustained gaze, the cat fixing its attention on a specific location for extended periods, described in the text as an active barrier held in place by that attention. And seventh, described in the proposed translation as the function the scribe's own teachers could not fully explain. The purr, a low vibrating sound described within the text as a designed frequency that closes whatever portion of a threshold location remains open after the other 6 functions have been performed. This is the point in the proposed translation that viewers are most likely to find either compelling or immediately skeptical, depending on their prior inclinations. Each of the 7 described functions corresponds precisely to a well-documented and independently well-understood feline behavior. Cats do sleep near warmth and companions. Cats do investigate novel stimuli. Cats do scent mark through facial rubbing. Cats do have nocturnal activity bursts. Cats do exhibit sustained visual fixation on small stimuli invisible to human perception. Cats do purr, and the vibration frequencies of purring have been documented and studied within veterinary science. The proposed translation takes each of these independently explicable behaviors and inserts them into a single unified mythological framework, attributing a supernatural protective purpose to each one. Whether this pattern reflects a genuine ancient understanding of cats or reflects a modern narrative constructed around real behaviors is something the available evidence cannot settle. And it is a pattern worth being aware of, since it makes the account feel internally coherent in a way that does not depend on any external verification. The text, according to this proposed reading, addresses near its end what would happen if cats were no longer present in human dwellings, framing their continued presence as essential to maintaining a kind of civilizational protection. The scribe reportedly addresses future readers directly, warning that already in his own time, temple officials were beginning to treat cats as ordinary animals. The text reportedly closes with a line Ashworth rendered as, "The cats remember what we have forgotten, and this is why they look at us the way they do." Some researchers who engage with this material have proposed that ancient Egypt's extraordinary reverence for cats represents a cultural inheritance from the Sumerian framework described in this translation, that the Egyptians preserved, through Bastet and through cat mummification, a memory of the cat's original described purpose. This is one proposed interpretation. Mainstream Egyptologists do not trace Egyptian cat reverence to Sumerian origin in this form, and the culture's different geographical and chronological relationships to cat domestication are studied through independent archaeological evidence rather than through textual inheritance claims. The account also describes the medieval European campaign against cats, documented historically as connected to associations between cats and witchcraft, particularly from the 12th century onward, and proposes that this period represents the consequence of removing the described protective function. This is a rhetorically effective narrative connection, but it is one built on accepting the unverified tablets framework as a starting premise, rather than on independent historical evidence. It is worth pausing here to separate clearly what is established from what remains claimed and unverified. What can be independently verified? Nippur was a real and extensively excavated Sumerian city, and the 1920s excavations there produced large quantities of material, including many minor, understudied tablets. The University of Pennsylvania Museum holds significant Mesopotamian collections from these excavations. Cats are documented in the ancient Near Eastern archaeological record, and ancient Egypt's reverence for cats is independently and extensively documented within mainstream Egyptology. The medieval European persecution of cats is historically documented. The behavioral characteristics of cats described in the Seven Function passage are all real and independently well studied within veterinary and behavioral science. What has not been independently verified: the specific existence and content of tablet N2847 as described here, the identity, career, and translation work of Eleanor Ashworth, the term mushdub as an authentic Sumerian word, any of the specific translation content presented in this documentary. None of these claims appear in peer-reviewed Sumerological literature in the form described. What remains genuinely open: whether a tablet matching this description exists in the form claimed, and whether independent access could confirm or refute the proposed reading. What is worth holding on to, regardless of the specific and unverified claims explored in this documentary, is a genuine historical reality that requires no disputed tablet to be remarkable. Cats and humans developed a close relationship in the ancient Near East thousands of years ago, a relationship that became one of the most extraordinary expressions of animal reverence in any recorded ancient civilization, and that has persisted in different forms across human cultures ever since. That history is documented through genuine archaeology, genetics, and art history, and it remains an active area of legitimate scholarly research. Whether tablet N2847 adds anything genuine to that record is a question that rigorous, verifiable scholarship would need to settle. Until then, the question remains open. And open questions, examined honestly, are where understanding begins.